why don't we start by scratching a little bit beneath the surface of your bios? You know, they were very basic, but we know you're both very accomplished folks. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background and the type of work that you do? Why don't we start with you, Pune?
So thank you, Lori, for that introduction. My name is Pune Saberi, and I'm a physician in occupational and environmental medicine. About 5 years ago, I started to read a lot more about shale gas development, specifically in Pennsylvania. And what really intrigued me was, so my specialty is about how the environment affects your health. And I started to explore what is the impact of this fossil fuel industry on typically the communities that live around it. But as this, as shale gas development developed in Pennsylvania, then the issue became a lot of transportation, and it was brought home to Philadelphia in terms of how fossil fuel is transported through Philadelphia. And so I would say about 5 years ago is when I really started to look at this issue in depth. And then about 3 years ago, I became part of a kind of a collective of physicians, mainly, but healthcare professionals who are looking at the health impacts of climate change. Because as you know, there is what climate change leads to, but also what causes climate change also has its own health effects. So it's this there's kind of a double whammy going on. And so since then, I've been really investigating this, and Paris was kind of, and we can talk a little bit more about that too. But that's the road that's brought me here. I'll stop right there, and then maybe we can talk about Paris a little bit later.
I taught high school, and I had students who came from very wealthy suburbs of North Jersey, students who came from Irvington and Newark, primarily Black and Latino, and very low income, all in the same classroom. And as a very naive young postgraduate student walking into that space, I only looked at international as a place of focus, and I was clueless to what was happening within our own borders here in the United States. And the amount of environmental injustices taking place in Newark that some of my students had to deal with day to day was like eye-opening. And I was like, what in the world is going on? And it was very clear that there was also a very deep racial line where that was happening, where it was primarily Black and Latino immigrant communities who were dealing with this toxic pollution, inadequate transportation, poor economic opportunities compared to majority of the white students in my class. So I really was curious about that. After a couple years teaching, went to grad school, learned more, and found myself at the Center for Social Inclusion, which is a national nonprofit that works deeply in partnership with grassroots communities to help support ways to think about policy solutions to those structural barriers, to pollution, to transportation issues, to a lack of access to the broadband, lack of access to medical help or doctors or medical education. And as we were doing this work, we had worked with a group of Black farmers in South Carolina who were facing incredible amounts of land loss. And they were mostly in their mid-50s, mid-60s, were not able to get financial loans to maintain their lands. Their agricultural economy was plummeting because of climate change. They were not able to produce as much crops as they normally had in the past. And they were unincorporated, and they had an opportunity to incorporate with Columbia, which meant if they incorporate, they would get infrastructure, they would get power lines to their communities. Believe it or not, this is like late 90s and there still was not good power in South Carolina. They would get sewage, they would get better roads. So you had a lot of opportunities to incorporate. But they knew that if they incorporated, they would probably lose their lands much quicker than if they did not, because it would increase property taxes, but their income was not going up. And their land would become desirable, because if there was infrastructure there, that would make it much more desirable to commercial interests. So they were stuck. They're like, we want to incorporate because we want to improve our community, but we don't want to incorporate because we don't want to lose our land. And so one of the farmers had said, hey, there's a changing climate. We need to get off fossil fuel addiction. What about putting community-owned winds on our lands? We can generate clean energy, we can transition to a clean energy economy, and that can be revenue for us, and we actually can own our infrastructure. And my boss at the time, Maya, was like, that is the most brilliant thing I've ever heard, and I have no idea how you're going to do that. And so our energy democracy program was really born out of this idea from farmers in South Carolina who were saying, we want to own infrastructure. Like, you don't need to own land anymore to get access to the coal, because that's not feasible, it's not necessary. You don't need a pipe for gas. Like, wind and solar is all around. If we just get the right technology, like, we can do this, and we need to make that happen. And so now it becomes down to a big conversation of how do we make sure the policies work so that farmers, like the ones in South Carolina, can actually participate. And so that's kind of how I backed into climate change, is actually through seeing the impacts on students and also understanding the economic opportunities that face communities of color, in particular in the South, and then across the country.
So let's pick up on that, Anthony, and we'll continue with you and talk a little bit about what led you to Paris and what your role was.
What led me to Paris was, so I was not aware of COP or, Conference of Parties or, any of what's called UNFCCC, the United Nations framework for climate change. I forget what the last C is. But Copenhagen was probably the first one that the news filtered down to filtered through to what I was reading, and I would say that actually really I knew more about the Copenhagen through the documentary The Island President, that if you haven't seen, you should definitely see it. It's amazing, about the president of the Maldives, one of the island nations. And we can talk about the important role of the island nations in Paris Summit. But so Copenhagen, and then I think it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago when it was held in Doha, and I was very struck by the involvement of the Arab youth, because the Arab nations, even in Paris, were the biggest blockers of much of this, and so I was really struck by that. About how their main economy is this, and yet they're out in the street walking this. And then last year, what happened was that the concept of health made its way through the agreement, and that was a new thing, because up until now, health wasn't its own issue. It was kind of one of those things where, people would get diseases and there'll be vectors. What I felt I really needed to do and I wanted to do was, go there to Paris this year, and just kind of like, if I can imagine this, big wheel, just be kind of like one of the people pushing this wheel forward. Mainly in terms of the concept, that the understanding that when people talk about all these various things, they need to mention health among those things. And so as it turned out, that actually it does now appear in the agreement in 2 places. And one of them, even though it's only in the preamble, and we can talk about kind of what that means, the word right to health is, is right up there. So, so that's what I would say. Mm-hmm.
And then for myself, it was a couple different things. So we work a lot, as I said earlier, with grassroots community groups. And so there's a coalition or alliance called the Climate Justice Alliance, which is about 45 different grassroots groups around the US. And they've been mobilizing since Copenhagen and the US Social Forum back in 2009. And they were sending a huge contingent to Paris. We're an ally, so we did not go as the contingent, but I wanted to go and kind of support some of the work that they were doing outside of the negotiations. That was one piece. Another piece of this was, we do a lot of talk about energy democracy in the US, but we are woefully behind the times compared to the rest of the world. And I had an opportunity to be engaged in a panel with some of the leaders in Latin America and in Europe who actually were advancing these principles much further ahead than we are. And so it was a huge learning opportunity, and also an honor to be able to actually participate in this conversation with folks. And so that was another reason why I went. And the third is, legal framework is really critical, both whether it's local in Philly, whether it's national with the US or international. Having a legal framework really kind of has, it puts some weight to what we talk about. So we could talk what we want to do about climate change till we're blue in the face. But if we don't have any roadmap or any pathway to implementing it, then we're going to be underwater. So we really need to have a legal framework. And I was really curious around what is the impact that an international legal framework has on our work within the US. And so I got to also go and was accredited to observe and participate with US members in the US Climate Action Network around thinking about how do we make sure our legal framework is going to go through and what can we take from that legal framework to apply to the US to ensure that we push the most progressive forward-thinking policies here.
I just have to say one last thing. I just need to acknowledge the organization International Society of Doctors for Environment who agreed to send me as their delegate. Just need to acknowledge them.
Great, thank you. So before we get to the guts of the agreement and your impressions about that, I'd like to hear a little bit about what it was actually like to be there, you know, in watching it from afar. The atmosphere it blew me away. In some ways it seemed almost like a carnival, and in other ways it was so formal and everybody in their suits. And so I was just, you know, wanted to hear sort of firsthand, you know, what it felt like to be there. What are some things that you observed? You know, what was, you know, what really struck you that you could talk to us? And I know that you guys have a little bit of video or photographs.
Yeah, there we go. So, okay, so this is a picture of what happens is, you know, this is Le Bourget, and that's outside of Paris. It's in the suburbs of Paris. And so, you know, I was staying downtown in the center of Paris, and then you have to take this kind of commuter rail, which is super fast. And then you have the free shuttles from the station to this place, which is kind of actually, there's like a big tent behind this that they had set up. It's huge. It's got, you know, a bunch of many different halls. And so when you get off the shuttle, there's, you know, all these kind of rows of flags up here. They're passing out, you know, apples down here. And then when you go through those doors, so I would say the thing that struck me was the security. It was like security after security after security. I mean, it was like every time you had to go anywhere, it was like getting on an airplane. And we all know, you know, how delightful that is. Ooh, sorry. Yeah, so that's a poster that I took a picture of. And it says 1.5 to stay alive. And that was the motto of the island nations. And we can talk about that, but I mean, maybe I'll just go ahead and talk about it now because I just feel like it was such an important central piece of this, which is that, I mean, you know, originally, I mean, the talk was all about 2 degrees, and the island nations were like, no way, you know, you are killing us. We're going to die if it's 2 degrees. And so, and this whole notion of the fact that 2 degrees is still too much, and to push towards 1.5, I really think was actually one of the reasons what makes it even better than we thought, because of the will of these island nations. And then there was this exhibition of these really amazing photographs, and I took a picture of a bunch of them, but I only chose one to demonstrate for today. And I chose this because they're standing in water, and yet the drinking water that they have is so little. And so just to demonstrate the contrast between kind of, you know, lack of potable water as a result of climate change that are happening in so many places in the world today, but also will be something that we would have to face and yet be standing in, you know, like flood water. Next one. I think it was, I forget, maybe like Bangladesh, but I'm not sure. I have the little tag, but I didn't, you know, include it with this. I like this one because this is kind of one of the solutions. This is the people are biking to get the juice machine going. So you juice your own. So you pedal to, you know, charge your phone, to, you know, I don't know, like mix the batter for your cake. And then this was another solution where this tree, these little things turn with the wind, and then they generate these little currents of electricity. And this one tree provides electricity for streetlights.
Like Pune said, security was intense. And it was a little unnerving because even on every subway, there was AK-47s, and you had to remind yourself that it was like they just did have an attack about like 3 weeks before. And so that was a little bit unnerving, like walking around and just seeing people with these intense weapons around. But the feeling was, so it was fascinating. It was a very fascinating experience. I've actually never been to Paris before. I also don't speak a word of French, despite my attempts. It was really abysmal. But the inside was extremely, in a lot of ways, very formal. And if you were to do any type of protest actions inside the UN, you actually it had to be sanctioned and regulated and like reviewed by the UN and the police. If you went outside of any of the protocol, they would actually debadge you and kick you out of the conference for good. So there was an action which, actually, if you could pause real quick. So I'll get to the actions in a second. This was in between the sessions. So they had climate negotiations week 1 and during week 2. That weekend was it was out in a suburb, not near Le Bourget, but on the other side of Paris. A suburb where they have the alternative solutions. And there was the People's Climate Summit was that weekend, and that's where I participated in the Energy Democracy panel. But they had all these kind of, it was
Carnival.
a carnival is a perfect way to describe it. And they had this piece of art, which I thought was profound. So it was the Statue of Liberty, and it was these immigrants and refugees, they were climate refugees. And of course you think, oh, the book probably says something about welcoming the refugees or something. And when you look closely, it says freedom to pollute. And on top of the light was actually the smoke coming out. And it was like this totally ripping effect because I was out there with a bunch of the U.S. contingent, and of course we're all thinking, oh, we're like fighting, to fight against climate change. We're here, like we're with people, we're with the world. We're like trying to drive this deep justice-oriented solution. Yet the rest of the world sees this about the U.S. And it was not surprising, but it was definitely like a eye-opening,
totally
like
embarrassing.
it was embarrassing. It was an
Slightly
embarrassment, and I was like, oh.
Yeah.
And I would joke that every time I met someone, I would apologize, like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm American. Mostly because I was apologizing because I couldn't speak French. But at the same time, it was also like apologizing, like, I'm sorry, I'm an American, like that our country has done so much harm to create this problem. But no one had, I never got any ill will or attacked by anyone, like, oh, you U.S. person. But the imagery was like really profound. And then there's another, going to the actions, sorry if you can skip through. So here's one. So this is the Indigenous Environmental Network, and they're phenomenal. I recommend, if folks don't know about them, to visit ienearth.org. It's a profoundly amazing group of, they're actually domestic, but they have a huge international network of Indigenous community leaders in our country. And they did this Canoes to Paris rally. And so they wanted to bring in an original canoe from the US over. It did not work, so they rented canoes and they paddled out into the Seine. And they did this protest and this action and talking about defending water, defend the rights to Mother Earth, and talked a lot about the ecocide and the genocide happening based on UN sanctioned programs like REDD, which on the face of it sounds great because it's talking about conserving forests and it's reforestation. But what's happening is a lot of indigenous communities in Brazil are actually being forcibly removed from their lands so that Brazil can plant monocrops and then sell that to Chevron and say, you now have a carbon neutral facility because you bought these offsets in Brazil.
Can you just explain for a moment what REDD is for those who might not know?
I actually forget the name of what it stands for, but it's reforestation.
It's like, it's sort of like an offset.
It's an offset. So you can plant trees and offset the carbon that you use. And it's a market-based solution, and it's actually within the UN framework. It's highlighted as like one of the best solutions to climate change. But technically, Al Rinaldi could continue to pollute at Philadelphia Energy Solutions. Phil Rinaldi. Sorry, Phil Rinaldi can continue to pollute, and he could buy a bunch of trees in Brazil and claim carbon offsets and claim carbon neutral. Technically, under this program, that would be sanctioned. So the people on the front line, though.
Can I just say something about that? In the agreement, though, there is language on what's called double counting, where you can't double count. So right. That's actually kind of one of the concepts that I would say is a plus for this agreement.
But it does highlight, I think, the idea that some of the cap and trade and carbon offsets that are traditionally thought of by those who don't scratch beneath the surface as being a really good solution
Right.
to this
Yeah.
challenge. But many who know better and who see the real impacts of that the polluters can continue to pollute at the sites, like for example in Newark, and that the people in these communities can no longer access the forest maybe where they've always been. That's something that I think people are trying to spread the word about because it's not mainstream yet.
Right. Exactly. So this action was huge. Bill McKibben was there. They had like a lot of press. It was great. The same contingent of folks who were accredited to be within the UN also did an action, and that they were not allowed to have a sign that had genocide on it. They couldn't say ecocide. Otherwise, they would have been debadged and kicked out of the conference. So outside, there was like total free to do whatever, and then in the most part, and then inside the UN, it was like this very sanctioned action. They had 15 minutes to make their case, and they had to move on. So that was like a fascinating difference as well, being able to be in both spaces and seeing how that played out. Yeah, and then we can
Okay.
move on.
Okay. Let me go back to. I think it was this one. So I was thinking a little bit about all of the expectations and the emotions heading into the summit between all the sort of pressure of, a failed summit in Copenhagen to the terrorist attacks that had just happened. It seemed as though things were, very heated up, I guess, and had the potential to be very tense. So you touched on this a little bit with the security and things, but I was wondering if you could set the stage for us and maybe if you are familiar with sort of what happened from previous summits as it provides a context for our next question, which will be going into the actual agreement.
Want me to go? I had been visiting family in overseas and actually Middle East, and even though I was with my family, I couldn't wait to get to Paris. I was so excited. I was like, I just was kind of counting days till I would get there, and on the day that I got there, and I made it to the UN tent, I was like beside myself with excitement. I just felt like this is so great. It's really going to happen. We're really going to do this. And I would say that it was almost kind of like an all or none thing. Like Copenhagen was a failure. Never again are we going to let that happen again. And so, I was just kind of like, and then until like my jet lag and fatigue and everything like hit me, and lost luggage and stolen jewelry and stuff. And so, and then throughout the week, I would say the understanding the negotiations in and of themselves were extremely educational, highly educational. However, the fact that like there are these kinds of these barriers like shoulds versus shalls, and compensation and liability versus loss and damage, and which is kind of another concept that we can talk about. And I was like, what are they talking about? Like, why don't we just get on with this? Like the lives of everybody is dependent on this. Like, why are they squabbling over one word? And so it's kind of like a high and then a kind of a low. And then on Saturday, when it actually happened, I was, at the airport, like on my way back, it was just total elation. I was like, yay, we did it. It happened. And, this is so great. And then come back to Philly, and kind of attend a few meetings with, some of the various, pieces that I'm involved with. And it was kind of like Paris was in the Paris time zone, and then Philly's in Philly time zone. Like literally, and so it was. Did you guys not get the memo? We had an agreement in Paris. Do you know what this? So it was more like like you said, you can have these different emotions at the same time. It was almost a roller coaster. It was like a high, low, high, low. So that's kind of what I would say was, my, general emotional reaction.
There's almost a shift in thinking about this just being the agreement, and actually a shift into thinking about this is about peace. Like climate solutions is also, it's peace. It's not, I mean, yes, it's about the earth and it's about people, but at the end of it, it's like creating peace with, our maker, with each other, with the world. And I think, the interesting thing, and how, I was thinking a lot about the response post-Paris attacks, the response that happens around, even within the United States, around all of a sudden wanting to like not let any Muslims in the country, to we should check everything, and people saying, are you going to be okay? It's not safe in Paris, yet we're having mass gun shootings every day, it seems like, in this country. So a lot of that was kind of racking through my brain as I left to go to Paris. And a lot of people took this as like, this is a huge moment around climate, and it's around peace, and we need to seize upon it now. Like, we're at a really critical juncture. And so I think that was kind of some of the background that I kind of carried into this space. Also, roller coaster, I think so some of the groups we work with are not happy with the agreement. A lot of it has to do with concerns about implementation, concerns about, again, indigenous rights. While there's some language in the preamble for it, there's no kind of deep commitment to actually seeing through indigenous rights in the agreement itself. There's these concerns about carbon offsets being the solutions, and a lot of the groups we work with are the ones that live next to power plants, and so they're like, we're not going to benefit. So there was some of that, kind of disappointment, but at the same time, they also knew that wasn't going to change at Paris necessarily. But what was going to change was the momentum that people actually had. And I think everyone, no matter where you stand on the agreements, I think everyone left Paris, leading up to Paris, but really leaving Paris, saying, we are at a point in this movement where people are taking it and moving it. So this is no longer going to be people behind the back doors who are going to create this solution. It's no longer going to be the very well-resourced organizations that are at the table. Like, this is a people movement. And we are hit that point where that's happening. And so you could be super excited about the agreement. You could be super disappointed about the agreement. But I think the one thing that everyone, at least from my perspective, everyone agrees on was like, from here on out, nothing will be the same, because the people they've taken to the streets, they've taken to their Congress people in the US, they've taken it to legislators across the country. They are building their own solutions. Like, people are there and people are moving. And so everyone, despite the disappointments or excitement, everyone's very hopeful about what's ahead, which I thought was good. It was good out of all this.
I know what I've been reading, I've heard everything from, joyous, we've solved the problem, to this is, a piece of crap. So I feel better about things sort of hearing what you guys have to say. So I thank you for that. And I think that maybe there's some people in this room that follow the agreement and know every piece of it, and then there's others that are like, I'm not sure about what this is. So could you guys provide a bit of an overview on your sense of the agreement and how you feel about it?
Yeah. I think that maybe I'll just go right to this concept that I think I would like to, at the end, bring to Philadelphia. And whatever I forget, feel free to jump in. There's different components to the agreement. Clearly, the one that gets the most press is the one that says, aiming for global temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius while aiming for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I would say that the thing that I think maybe people feel kind of betrayed by is the fact that if they've talked about anthropogenic greenhouse gases throughout the agreement, but not once is there ever mention of fossil fuels. So I think that not maybe, in my opinion, I believe that's part of this dichotomy that happens. And so what they mention also is net zero carbon, not no carbon. Mm-hmm. So so for example, this kind of, offsetting in somewhere else counts. It could be part of an INDC. An INDC is the plan that each country submits to the UN as what they're going to do, what is their plan for lowering the greenhouse gas. And then there's the carbon capture and sequestration, which is that theoretically, so as Anthony said, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening around Paris during this time. And there was the conference, there was a space right by it, and then there was all these different places around the city. One of them was this thing called Solutions COP21. And so that's where it was kind of like industry showcasing their solutions. And so clean coal is a solution. I know, it's right, this is the audience that gets laughs about that, right? Scrubbers, natural gas scrubbers, for the folks who know what that is. So you're kind of scrubbing the air clean. So those are solutions. So under this agreement, those are technically what an INDC can have. So
Nuclear is part of that?
nuclear could be part of that. Nuclear could be part of that. So I would say, to your point of, joyous versus dismay, I think maybe it's kind of like they say we have to do something, but they didn't touch the elephant in the room. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about stock take and the 5-year cycles and stuff, or no? No, okay.
I don't know if I'd be able to speak about that.
Okay.
So the point that the area that was most of interest to me was actually there was a big argument over whether or not to include human rights language within the agreement or within the preamble, and it ended up in the preamble. The United States pushed for it in the preamble and was vehemently against it in the agreement as Article 2.1. Not sure why, but anyway. So but I was really interested in that because within this human rights language, it was actually talking about a right to health. It was indigenous rights, gender rights, race, social. It talked about just transition, so thinking about a just transition for workers. Disabilities. So this
women.
was women. I mean, this was like a huge piece that if it was within Article 2, for what an international binding agreement could be in the sense of binding, it would have made it a little bit more real for people to say the UN actually recognizes and is making legally binding a recognition of human rights. In the preamble, it doesn't have that same weight. So it's in the preamble, which is good, but it didn't go far enough. So there was a lot of, I think, that's where some of the other big disappointment was just, again, this not willing to actually recognize the rights of people. Was disappointing. And then the other piece that we were really interested in is the thing about the climate finance. And there was some great artwork I wish I would have gotten pictures of that went around climate finance. And basically climate finance is what the world will provide, both the global north and the global south. So it could actually go to communities in the United States, for example. But it's finance to do adaptation, mitigation, and to kind of create solutions to knowing that the sea level is going to rise or whatever climate change is going to be happening, climate impacts on your community, that you can actually work to adapt to that. The agreement said they would continue $100 billion up to 2025. No guarantee after 2025, so you're looking at a 10-year window of $100 billion per year. But it also there was language saying whether making it would be that the super rich nations would actually give that money versus mobilize that money. And it ended up saying mobilize that money. And there's a lot of different angles on that. Some people say mobilize is great because you don't have to get congressional approval. Other people say mobilize is terrible because that means it gets us off the hook. I can't speak. I mean, there's a lot of different interpretations. But it was not as strong as it could. It could have been much stronger language, and they opted for the weaker language. So that was like the other kind of disappointment within the agreement, that there was not as much of a stronger dedication to climate finance. And a lot of people also were saying, oh, it's just aid. It's more aid to the global south and to these developing countries. And there was a big push against, no, it's not aid. This is like reparations, or it's righting wrongs, or it's like it's paying for the damage that we have done that these countries did not do. That's not aid. That is like, reconciliation. It's something other than aid. But the industrialized nations would call it aid as a way, I think, to also argue against giving more money, which was an interesting thing to see and see how that played out.
Yeah.
So I think you both touched on this, but sort of as part of this question, I was wondering about the role of the United States, both at the talks and now that we're home, you know, in making sure that this is successful. Can you guys speak to your impression of that?
Yes. So, U.S. By all accounts took significant leadership in this conference, and I think that's one of the reasons why there was a sense of optimism about it. For the people who were feeling optimistic. And that had to do with, I think, several different things. Number one, Secretary Kerry was there the entire second week. And so I attended a press conference with the U.S. delegates, and they had said that there's never been anything where the Secretary of the State had been in one place for one whole week. So it was like the importance of this was highlighted by that. The second thing was that U.S. joined this coalition of the high ambition countries. It's 100 high ambition countries. So just to kind of like the framework is that, right? Leading up to Paris, 196 countries. Was it 196? Who?
Yeah.
Okay. Who submitted their INDCs, right? These plans for their countries, right? And then they get there and they work on this agreement, and essentially what needs to happen is that they have to review it in 2018 and then ratchet it up by 2020. So that's the stock take. It's called the global stock take. And then there's this 5-year cycle where every 5 years, their plan has to get kind of like, amped up. And then so there's this coalition of high ambition countries where they were kind of like upping the ante in terms of what they were really going to do to curb greenhouse gases. And so if you remember from Kyoto, not one senator signed on to the Kyoto Protocol. And so this time for U.S. to join this high ambition coalition was definitely kind of a change in tone.
The reason why 1.5 reference got in there was a combination of the small island state nations pushing it, and also apparently the U.S. having meetings with them to also be an advocate in the negotiations. So I thought that was actually something that was good, that was there. I talked a little bit about some of the troublesome things the U.S. did, so I won't go there. I think just thinking about within the U.S., we have our Clean Power Plan. Again, there could be good and bad.
That's U.S.'s INDC. Right.
Yeah, the U.S.'s commitment is going to be through President Obama's Clean Power Plan, which every state is supposed to do. Some states that won't do it have to follow a federal plan. A lot of good organizing around that is taking shape and moving. But I have to be nonpartisan. But I will say there is a particular wing of people who, unlike the rest of the world where climate change is not a debate, it's like how do we solve it's the debate. In the U.S., it's still climate change is the debate. So it's going to be really hard to move things nationally for the foreseeable 4 to 6 years until we get redistricting again, until we have a 2020 where we have to redraw the map. Because if you poll the U.S., the majority of people think climate change is happening, we need to do something about it. That's not represented in national decision making. So it's really going to come down to local and states to really lead the way. And so I think you have California and you have New York as kind of the two big states that are really trying to push and show that they have the solutions to climate change. Again, you can go different ways, seeing how you agree or disagree with their solutions, but they're moving it and they're pushing. And I think it's something that's actually really empowering for us to think about this, is that we actually have a huge role to play. So it's both on an individual level, how we do our own individual way of living, but actually as a city, we actually have a tremendous opportunity to shape the way the U.S. plays in the climate, in solving climate change or leading to a faster acceleration of climate change, because of the way it's set up. So there's actually a lot of opportunity for us to be able to move, and I think that's actually probably the most empowering piece that I also thought about as we were coming back, like that we have an opportunity to move a new mayor, to move a city council, to be ambitious, and this is another great thing about the Paris Agreement is this gives us a backdrop to be ambitious. If we were feeling not sure about it before, to reach 1.5 degrees basically means we cannot produce anything carbon by 2050. We have to be carbon free. But by 2050 for sure. There's no way. Which means our long-term plans shouldn't be based on fossil fuel infrastructure. We have to have that conversation now, and I think we can. So that's actually really exciting that there's a lot of opportunities that states and local entities can play if we're mobilized and able to move.
remember what I was going to say. So the thing that I was going to say was that so originally there was a discussion about what's called compensation and liability, meaning that developed countries would compensate the losing countries, the countries that have that have had to essentially that have suffered from results of climate change. And that was one of the U.S.'s negotiating points, to remove that and make it what's called loss and damages, where loss and damages is where you try and avoid the consequences for the losing countries, like let's say the Marshall Islands that has to move their entire nation to some like island off the coast of Japan. So it's not that they would be compensated for that, but their loss and damages would be minimized. And it doesn't say that anybody in particular is responsible for that. It would just say that there's this kind of like global effort to minimize that. And that was done so that this doesn't have to go to Congress. So it was actually kind of like this negotiating chip that the U.S. played. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, there's some great articles out there about behind the scenes of how the agreement was made, and I found it to be really fascinating on what roles different countries took, how they worked together, what almost broke the deal and things like that. So I would encourage everyone to do a little bit of reading on that. So we're going to get ready to wrap up soon, but I wanted to ask you about this global climate movement that was already coming with a tremendous amount of momentum, both internationally and here. And now in light that we have this framework, but yet many people, feel that it's not really enough to get us where we need to go in the amount of time. How do you see the global climate movement, sort of, taking it up now and altering how they're doing things, or, doubling down, and then bringing it down to the local movement? And we'll be having more of a group discussion on this afterwards. How do you see us here, really being able to make a difference in, moving this plan forward to where it needs to be?
So I would start with the sense that I think in the global movement for climate justice, actually that term climate justice has really taken off. And people have been using it over varied amounts of years, but I think the level of use in the global setting was profound. It was pretty amazing to see. It was like whether it was any continent, Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, North America, US, and Canada, like climate justice was a constant theme that was moving. And it was one of those points where you feel there's a tipping point, and I feel like we're at a tipping point in a global movement about making a change. And so there was I thought I put this video on my jump drive, but I didn't. The last day I was at the negotiations inside, there was a lot of folks from the small island states and nations, a lot of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, the It Takes Roots, which is the U.S. Climate Justice Alliance groups, all kind of did this very last-minute protest within the COP space. And it was great because they actually they took over the entire space and were doing different chants and had different signs, but it had to be close to about 300 people. But climate justice was the frame. And one of the points that they were saying is, from here on out, they call it civil, in the international space it's called civil service, or civil society organizations. So the civil society, they're like, we will no longer be ignored from here on out. Like, this was like a statement like that we are changing the game. So I think there was a lot of that energy and excitement that was there, both from the outside events at the Alternative Village and the People's Climate Summit to inside of that protest was pretty apparent. And then just locally, there's Green Justice Philly, which is doing amazing work. There's Philly Thrive. There's other groups who've been moving, I think, a deep justice agenda. And we have Black Lives Matter, and Power, people are talking. I think that's the exciting thing is people are talking across different movements. That didn't always happen. And so I think climate justice is a really great framework for us to actually have very deeply intersectional alignment building within the movement, which actually just makes us stronger locally to be able to move our agenda.
Globally, what I felt was really pronounced was the finances, the business aspect of it, and the fact that there is actually, like, the market might really determine for a lot of countries where this is going to go, because a lot of the countries for whom climate change is not a debate, they see the writing on the wall, they have a carbon cap, and they're just going to go on ahead, with what makes business sense for them. And I actually see China in that category. Despite the fact, that we see all the pictures of smog and, the coal power, but really they're just kind of like burning it up, and then they're just moving ahead. In the next 5 years, they're going to transition to, renewables, and many, many other countries the same way. Whereas here, we all know that the technology for transition is here. The finances, as we said, there is a driving market force that's behind it, and so the only thing that's really stopping us is the political will, and that, to me, I actually see that as the kind of the central piece of what we need to do here in Philadelphia, which is that there's people like in city council, in the government, in the governor's office, the mayor's office, who still think that fossil fuels still has a role, and I think that for us, we just need to never support a candidate for whom that's on their agenda. Like, that just can't happen. Because either, fine, so maybe we've now kind of like slowed our, drop off the cliff, but we will drop off the cliff. And so in order for us not to do that, we can't have people like them making the decisions. And in order for that to happen, we need to have more candidates who put themselves out there as candidates, because if you don't have candidates that you can vote for, it doesn't matter that you show up to vote. And then show up to vote. But really just put like every candidate to that scrutiny in terms of, is it on your agenda? If it is, you're not going to get elected. So that's what I would say, frankly, about that.
Thank you. So we are so grateful that you guys were there representing us, and that you were able to come back and give us such a firsthand view of what it was like and what your impressions were. So thank you so much. So let's give a little round of applause to Anthony and Pune.